Welcome. My name is Andrew Penner. On behalf of the What Matters to Me and Why organizing committee, I am delighted to welcome you here. We're so glad that you're spending lunch with us. First one sort of organizational point. This talk is being filmed. So by entering the room, you are consenting to that. If you don't want to show up, please move to the back. I know it's like we're always telling everyone come to the front, but we won't be offended. Now, sort of moving on from that organizational point, I want to just sort of tell you a little bit about what the series is. And I think for me, when I think about our lives as staff, faculty, and students, we spend a lot of our time dealing with things that I would argue are mundane, but maybe not important, right? The things that we need to do to keep the university running. And what matters to me and why is a chance to sort of take a step back and think about the things that are important, right? Take a break from the busyness and hear from someone in our community. And our hope is that this moment provides an opportunity to understand each other, not just in terms of the role that we play in the university, but on a sort of deeper, more fundamental level. So our speakers give a short talk with a time for question afterwards, and there's no prescribed topic. Our speakers are simply asked to answer the question, what matters to them and why? To answer it frankly and authentically, and to take the talk wherever that takes them. I think a series like this is especially important in moments like the moment that we find ourselves in now, where our values are being contested, right? And I think it's more important than ever to celebrate both the diversity of our community and the commonalities that bind us together, and to sort of understand each other on this deeper level. So one of my favorite things about What Matters to Me and Why is that it brings people together from all across campus, right? Staff, faculty, graduate students, undergraduates. And so one of the traditions that we have is, in the spirit of being a community, is to turn to somebody you're sitting next to. Maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's someone you don't, and just to introduce yourself. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, maybe you can talk about something that you did over the winter break or a goal for 2026. In a few minutes, we'll bring you back and introduce the speaker.
My name is Judy Wu. I'm professor of history and Asian American studies at UC Irvine. I'm also an associate dean in the School of Humanities and recently joined the What Matters to Me and Why organizing committee. It's such a wonderful opportunity to really hear from our colleagues about what really drives them, what compels them to do the work that they do. And there's so much I want to say about Professor McClanahan, but I'll go over some of her main highlights and I'll turn it over to her. As you can see, she's an associate professor of English and a scholar of contemporary US culture and political economy. Her first book, Dead Pledges, Debt, Crisis, and the 21st Century Culture, explores how US culture responded to the collapse of the financialized consumer credit economy in 2008. It won the Best Book Prize from the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present. Her forthcoming book, Beneath the Wage, Tips, Tasks, and Gigs in the Age of Service Work, retheorizes capitalism and culture from the perspective of the service economy. She also works and teaches in the interdisciplinary field of critical university studies with essays on student debt, faculty labor, and educational technology. She's the co-founder of the UC Materialist Institute for Research, which is an initiative to support UC faculty and the graduate students engaged in historical materials-related research and pedagogy. She also proposed and co-directed the Black Studies Cohort PhD program, which recruited and supported underrepresented and racially marginalized students to humanities PhD programs at UCI, and I think maybe also the social sciences as well. Professor McClanahan co-chairs the Council of UC Faculty Associations, which is a coordinating organization of the faculty associations at 10 campuses of the UCs. And as you will learn more about today, she's the faculty co-director of UCI LIFTED, the first in-prison BA degree completion program in the UC system. LIFTED enables incarcerated individuals to apply to transfer into UCI as juniors and earn a bachelor's degree from UCI while serving their sentence. She coordinated LIFTED's English minor and supports faculty in learning to teach in carceral settings with a focus on trauma-informed pedagogy. In fact, she herself taught in the Prison University Project at San Quentin Correctional Facility from 2003 to 2010 as a volunteer instructor. In essence, Professor McClanahan is a visionary and activist scholar, teacher, and community leader. We're very lucky to have her at UCI.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really moved to see so many of you here. I'll particularly say that I'm glad to see my comrades in UCI Lifted here. Thank you all so much for being here. And also, I have a bunch of undergrads from the class that I taught last quarter here on main campus, and I'm really happy to see you guys. When I was first invited to give this talk last year and began to think about what I might say, a memory sprung immediately to my mind. It was early fall of 2020, deep in the pandemic, and I am sure I'm not alone in admitting that I myself was in a state of depression. I had a 6-year-old kid at home, I was director of graduate studies in my department, I was teaching my online courses and trying desperately to write my second book, and yet it all felt a bit meaningless. Like so many others, including I'm sure many of you, one of my only escapes was to take long walks around my neighborhood, and I often spent those walks on the phone with my best friend, who also happens to be an English professor. During one of those conversations, I remember crying a lot. I was probably crying about a bunch of things, but the main thing weighing on me was that I felt deep disillusionment with my professional life. None of it, not the research, not the admin work, and a lot of times not even the teaching, felt like enough. I didn't feel like my skills were adequately meeting a real social or collective need. I wanted, I told her, to just quit. My friend, a consummately patient listener, let me go on for a while, and then she stopped me. You don't need to quit, she said. You need to find a project that inspires you and motivates you and draws on what you already know how to do. Let's come up with a plan. I was lucky that day, lucky to have a friend who reoriented me to problem solving, but also lucky because when she said it, I immediately had a thought. Roughly a year earlier, I'd attended a few meetings for UCI faculty interested in a new pilot project that would soon come to be called UCI Lifted, short for Leveraging Inspiring Futures Through Educational Degrees, and designed to provide a BA degree for those incarcerated at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, a maximum security facility in Chula Vista, just south of San Diego and about a mile from the US-Mexico border. I'd served on a curriculum committee, and I'd also gotten to meet the person I am not embarrassed to say remains my personal hero, Karamet Ryder, UCI professor, sorry Karamet, I'm just embarrassing, UCI professor of criminology, law, and society, and the founder and director of Lifted. But my involvement in the program had not been much more than a few meetings up till that point, and I had no idea whether things were even still moving ahead, especially given the catastrophic disruptions of the pandemic. Still, my friend needed to hear that I had a practical plan to get myself out of my despair, so I promised that when I got home, I'd email Karamet and tell her that I really wanted to be more involved in Lifted. I did, and a year later, I was part of a team helping the first entry cohort to the program put together their applications to UCI. That first year, we had to do everything by hand, so a group would drive down to the prison, work with the students on their materials, which were mostly handwritten, and then set up their online application for them. I think Karamet single-handedly typed about 24 application essays into UC's online application system. A year after that, I was entering Donovan to teach my first class for the program. Lifted was not my first experience teaching incarcerated students. I was a PhD student at UC Berkeley from 2003 to 2010, and during that time, I taught almost every semester with a program that was then called the Prison University Project, an associate's degree program at San Quentin Correctional Facility. San Quentin is California's oldest operating correctional facility and is located on one of the most beautiful pieces of property in the Bay Area, on a kind of headland near San Rafael between the Golden Gate and Richmond bridges. Set up high, it overlooks the ocean. Parts of it look like the 19th century building it is, with castle-like turrets and old stone, but you can see guards with guns in watchtowers, and there are, of course, lots of large metal gates to walk through. There are lovely manicured gardens in parts, and elsewhere a lot of concrete. The program at San Quentin was founded in the late 90s as an entirely volunteer initiative run through Patton College, a small Christian college in Oakland. Although many of the volunteer instructors were faculty or grad students at UC Berkeley, the program could not be formally embedded in the UC system because in 1994, Bill Clinton's crime bill had eliminated Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated students, forcing hundreds of state and federally funded college programs to close. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. By the time I started teaching for PUP in 2004, it was serving hundreds of students per year. I taught courses ranging from a remedial writing course to literature classes where I taught Shakespeare and Kafka. When I remember my experience teaching at San Quentin, part of me remembers how incredibly hard it was. Every object we brought into the prison was examined by correctional staff, and it wasn't uncommon for a book or article you intended to teach to get taken away from you at the gate. Correctional officers were deeply suspicious of the program and keen-eyed to keep track of potential overfamiliarity. I remember vividly a particular officer who would mutter every week as we came through the Sally Port about how his kids couldn't afford a UC education while these lowlifes were getting it for free. San Quentin housing was at the time de facto racially segregated, and violence and chaos meant it was common to come to class only to discover that all the students of a given racial group were absent because their particular housing unit was locked down. Resources were scarce. Classes were taught in trailers, while a writing tutoring study hall, which I ran for a couple of semesters, was held in dirty, inadequately lit rooms divided by cages. The program was under-resourced. As the director of the program recently noted in a letter marking its 30th anniversary, they didn't have an industrial pencil sharpener until 6 years into offering classes. And the first time they bought pocket dictionaries for the entire student body, it was cause for celebration. Students wrote everything by hand, which meant reading and keeping track of everything was a constant strain on students and faculty. Students had no right to retain books or handouts or papers in their cells, which meant a student might show up to class without anything they had been given to study or to write. And yet, when we were close reading a poem or discussing a film or dissecting a run-on sentence, I would lose myself in the pleasure and the challenge of the work, just like I would in any other classroom. It's no exaggeration to say that teaching at San Quentin taught me how to teach. In the same years I was spending one night a week teaching a 2-hour class at San Quentin, during the day I was also teaching undergraduate writing courses at UC Berkeley. But it was my prison teaching where I really learned how to be effective in the classroom. One reason was that because San Quentin was an all-volunteer effort, most classes were team taught so that instructors could divide themselves over the 2 nights of classes. In my early years in the program, that meant I was teaching alongside instructors far more experienced than I was, and I was learning on the fly. The first course I taught was remedial writing, which meant I had to give myself a crash course on the grammar exercises the very experienced writing instructor I was co-teaching with had assigned. Like many people who grew up in a middle-class English-speaking household, I had learned English syntax and grammar entirely intuitively. I was a good writer, but I couldn't identify parts of speech, diagram a sentence, or explain why what simply sounded right to me was correct according to the rules. But because I was teaching students who were English second language learners, or who had learning differences, or who had completed their high school degree via in-prison GED programs and hadn't had the educational opportunities I took for granted, I suddenly had to know the rules so I could teach them. Later in my time teaching at San Quentin, I myself became the expert, and I had the chance to serve as mentor to tenured full professors from Berkeley who were teaching in the program for the first time. That experience taught me a lot about becoming more secure in my own authority, something my students at San Quentin often forced me to confront. In my Berkeley teaching, I was typically teaching a room full of 18-year-olds, but at San Quentin, I was younger than almost all of my students, and as a result, I often felt insecure in my position. Many of my students were avid readers of history and knew more about it than I did. They had strong political and ethical and intellectual beliefs and, more than my teenage Berkeley students, were never afraid to express themselves, even, perhaps especially, when they knew I might disagree. Learning to manage these spaces taught me both how to be confident in my authority and also how to be flexible, taught me what it means to lose the comfort that comes from knowing exactly what will happen next and exactly how to handle it, and to embrace the curiosity and sense of possibility that comes from realizing that the classroom can be a community of peers, learning and talking together. But the main reason my experience at San Quentin changed me was my students. For my final class in the program, I designed a critical thinking course on the manifesto as a literary and rhetorical device, where we read Plato's Republic, the Declaration of Independence and 19th century feminist responses to it, hip-hop lyrics, professions of religious faith, and platforms from both mainstream and marginal contemporary political parties. For their final paper, I asked my students to write their own manifestos. And the experience got me thinking a lot about my own beliefs and how they'd been shaped by my experience in the program. Teaching there made me believe in what I came to see as miracles of human will, the kind of will it takes to write and rewrite difficult essays without a computer or a typewriter, to read difficult texts in a noisy, chaotic room, to develop organizational skills in a situation where your papers and books can be gone through, discarded, and disorganized beyond your control. It made me believe in miracles of individual courage, the kind of courage it takes to re-enter the classroom after years and years outside of it, even when your earliest educational experiences hardly inspired faith or confidence in the process or the institution. My beliefs about higher ed for incarcerated people are borne out by the facts. I know that these talks are meant to be more personal than empirical, but it's worth discussing at least a few facts about the context of incarceration, about the history of higher education in prisons, before I talk about my experience with UCI Lifted over the last 4 years. As you probably all know, but as is worth remembering, the US incarcerates more people per capita than almost every other nation. For decades, the US has been engaged in a globally unprecedented experiment to make every part of its criminal legal system more expensive and more expansive and more punitive, more expensive too. As a result, incarceration has become the nation's default response to crime. 70% of convictions result in confinement, far more than other developed nations with comparable crime rates. Even progressive states like California, with incarceration rates a bit below the national average, continue to lock up people at more than double the rates of some of our closest international allies. The average sentence length in the US is more than 5 years, 5 times the average in peer countries. 1/3 of California incarcerated individuals and the plurality of students in Lifted are serving life sentences, most of those so-called LWOP, or life without possibility of parole. 40% of incarcerated people serving life sentences were 25 years or younger when they committed the crime for which they are incarcerated. Beginning in 2010, but most appreciably in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, many US states began to see a decline in their prison populations. The US dropped from having the world's highest incarceration rate in the world to being only in the top 5. Yet even at the peak of so-called decarceration in 2022, the size of US prison population had only declined to the levels previously seen in 2005, which were themselves roughly 3.5 times higher than they'd been in 1980 when the war on drugs began. In 2023, 39 states saw increases in the size of the prison population, despite continued decreases in violent and property crime rates. In 2024, as I was teaching my fall course at Donovan, Californians may have congratulated themselves on voting against Trump, but they also overwhelmingly voted in favor of Proposition 36, which undid some of the modestly progressive sentencing reforms that had enabled the state's small efforts at decarceration, reclassifying drug and theft crimes, including petty shoplifting, as felonies. They also voted against Proposition 6, which would have repealed the part of the California Constitution that allows so-called involuntary servitude, aka slavery, as a punishment for crime. So given these horrors, what difference does an education make? Around 40% of incarcerated people have not completed high school or its equivalent, more than twice the rate in the overall population. When incarcerated people do receive an education while inside, recidivism rates drop substantially, from a reincarceration rate of around 60 or 70% to a mere 5% for those who earn a BA and near 0 for those who earn a master's degree. For every dollar spent on education for incarcerated people, there is an economic return of $5, and a college education is significantly less expensive than the cost of incarcerating someone for a single year in California. For those reasons, educating incarcerated people is economically, politically, and socially rational. But of course, there are far deeper reasons too. I think most of us who work in higher education see education as a human right, but it's one rarely afforded to those who are incarcerated. As faculty often argue when making the case for stronger state support for higher ed, access to education is an essential condition for personal transformation, success, and well-being. It is a crucial way that individuals find purpose, meaning, and dignity. It is also a vital social resource, not only a right, but also a gift, the best kind of gift, which is both useful and beyond utility, and which changes the person who gives it as much as the person who receives it. In other words, education, especially in places where it is most needed, where it is most vital, where it runs the most against the forces of repression and punishment, brings purpose and meaning and dignity, not just to the student, but to the teacher as well. It was that feeling, I think, that I had lost in 2020 and that my experience with Lifted restored to me. Before I talk about my own experience in Lifted, let me tell you a little about how the program and others like it came to be possible. Earlier, I mentioned that there used to be hundreds of prison college programs. As of the early 1990s, more than 20,000 incarcerated students were receiving Pell Grants to fund their education inside, double the number in the 70s when the program began. However, in those same decades, the prison population itself was exploding, increasing fivefold over just 20 years. In 1994, President Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, one of the most expansive crime laws in modern history. Among its many provisions, the law abolished the Pell Grant program for all prison students, including nonviolent offenders. As a result, public-funded institutions were basically prohibited from engaging in carceral education projects. But that began to change in California in 2014 when the state legislature began funding the California community colleges to educate incarcerated students. As of today, every single CDCR facility has at least 2 community colleges offering associate's degree pathways, with thousands of incarcerated students graduating with associate's degrees every year. Noting the incredible success of these programs, in 2018, UCI faculty, led by my hero Karamet, began discussing the possibility of a UCI BA program that would admit all those community college graduates as junior transfers. In 2020, in the midst of COVID, CDCR and UCI signed an MOU officially launching UCI Lifted, which would be the first top 10 public university to admit, matriculate, and graduate in-prison students with a BA. Initially, the program was funded with state funding, federal grants, philanthropic grants, and the UC Blue and Gold Opportunity Program. But at the same time things were changing in California, they were also changing at the federal level. In 2015, the Obama administration launched the Second Chance Pell Experimental Sites Initiative, a pilot project which funded roughly 70 colleges and universities to provide in-person, online, and hybrid education in carceral institutions. This program was expanded in 2020 and in 2021, the Trump administration finally repealed the ban on Pell Grants for in-prison higher education. In 2024, UCI Lifted became the second program in the country to be approved for Pell Grants. Lifted students are admitted to UCI as junior transfers via the exact same application process as traditional community college students. They enter as a cohort and take almost all of their courses together, which means there are very limited options but a very strong sense of community. I often tell folks that Lifted is a lot like a residential honors college or small liberal arts school where students live and study together in a group. Their BA is in sociology, and as of a year and a half ago, they also have the option to receive a minor in English, which is the part of the program I coordinate, and almost all of them choose to include it. Courses are taught seminar style and entirely in person. Students have access to a CDCR version of Canvas and a still partial but consistently improving set of research tools. We have so far graduated 2 cohorts, one more in the summer, both of them achieving amazing rates of Latin honors as well as honors in sociology. Of course, there's a lot about teaching at Donovan that's wildly different from teaching on main campus. The institution is located in Chula Vista, just south of San Diego. To get there, you drive for almost 2 hours along the beautiful coastline, but end up about a mile from the US-Mexico border in an area that's mostly Amazon warehouses, ICE and border facilities, and other carceral institutions. There's a shooting range right behind the yard where we teach, so you often hear the sound of gunfire. To get into my classroom, I go through a gatehouse, a security checkpoint, a sally port surrounded by a lethal electric fence, and then another security checkpoint. Once I'm inside, I walk across a large open yard where incarcerated people are doing everything from playing pickleball to strumming guitars. Entering the education building, I check in with yet another correctional officer and let them know I'm ready to let my students into the classroom. When my students enter the classroom, I greet not just them, but also a few incredibly well-behaved dogs, as many of our students are involved in a dog training program. Yet in many other ways, it's incredibly and sometimes overwhelmingly easy to forget where I am. I teach in a classroom not so very different from those on main campus. Indeed, it's probably a bit nicer than teaching in one of the social science trailers. There's a lot of UCI swag around, both posters on the walls and stickers and lanyards. My lifted students are incredibly proud of their institution, Anteater Fans 201. In terms of curriculum, the courses I teach through Lifted are also almost identical to the kind of courses I teach to upper div English majors on main campus. I've taught a course on Gothic fiction, for which they slogged through Henry James's very challenging novella Turn of the Screw, and in which they loved James Vandermeer's Gothic eco-horror novel Annihilation. I've taught a class on contemporary experimental novels, and I've twice taught a class, including this quarter I'm teaching it now, called The Novel as Sociology, which attempts to make connections between their sociology major and their English minor by focusing on novels that attempt to understand aspects of the social world. We just finished reading the 19th century novel Hard Times, Charles Dickens' excoriating criticism of industrialization and utilitarianism. We talk about literary devices like metaphor and image. We close read passages together and discuss the big questions novels ask and answer. We talk about paragraph structure and sentence syntax, about argument and evidence, about how to move from an intuitive feeling about a literary text to something more interpretive. When people ask me about teaching at Donovan compared to on campus, I often describe that the level of engagement. I love my lifted students' candor. Perhaps because they are adults with a wealth of life experience, they do not hesitate to tell me they hate a novel or don't like an assignment or that they just didn't have time to do the reading this week, though they almost always have. I love their passion, their curiosity, their honesty. I love how personally they take the reading, how pissed off they get when a character does something they don't think is plausible, and how able they are to see the connections to their own lives. One of the most powerful classroom experiences I've had at Donovan was teaching the novella The Yellow Wallpaper. An early feminist classic, The Yellow Wallpaper describes a woman being treated for what we'd now call postpartum depression by being locked in a room. Although I hadn't understood the story to be about solitary confinement when I assigned it, the conversation we had made me understand that it was. In turn, it allowed my students to connect their own experiences with this work of 19th century feminist fiction. The novelist George Eliot has written that literature allows us to, quote, be better able to imagine and to feel the pains and joys of those who differ from us in everything but the broad fact of being struggling, erring human creatures. In other words, literature teaches us how to see the world from the perspective of others and to learn compassion. When I teach at Donovan, I'm vividly reminded of this as the best, most extraordinary, most utopian thing that literature can do, that it can make us feel for others, that it can make us think otherwise, that it can give us opportunities for conversations we don't get to have in any other way. Theorists of the university and theorists of the prison have thought about the relationship between these two institutions in a number of ways. By the most common account, of course, the university and the prison are opposites. The prison is the darkness against which the university's fiat lux can be measured. The university is the space of freedom which the prison forecloses. But other scholars have noted that they are less opposites than twins. Both are what sociologists might call total institutions, enclaves where people live, work, and study under a system of regimented rules and discipline. By yet another account, the university is complicit in the production and maintenance of the prison. The famous scholar of California prisons, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, among others, has pointed out how the massive buildup of the carceral system in the 1980s and 90s California depended on the UC system as a, quote, supplier of efficiency expertise for the California Department of Corrections. In some ways, All of these ways of seeing the relationship are correct. And yet descriptions of the university and the prison as opposites, as analogs, or as collaborators also can't quite accommodate what happens when prisons and universities intersect. Both institutions are changed by this encounter, allowing knowledge to flow out of and between them. Through their sociology work, students in LIFTED are producing vital knowledge about their own lives and the carceral institution in which they live. Through their sociology courses, as well as in capstone and honors research seminars, LIFTED students are conducting compelling social research about prison education, prison communities, family support, and the obstacles to healing from trauma. Likewise, my own pedagogy has also been irrevocably changed by my teaching in LIFTED. In my first quarter teaching in LIFTED, I was immediately reminded of something I had noticed at San Quentin too, namely that my incarcerated students were even more invested in the nuances of grades than my UCI main campus students. They were far more likely to know why they'd gotten a 91, whereas their friend had gotten a 92. I came to feel that traditional grading systems mirrored aspects of prison life. The idea of highly structured, seemingly objective rules that have to be followed perfectly in order to produce a sense of security and stability. That realization made me want to use other ways of assessing and responding to student writing, and I began to develop various systems of what's often called ungrading, using quantitative feedback and an emphasis on effort, engagement, and improvement. Realizing I didn't want to use a carceral system outside the prison any more than inside it, I use those insights and approaches not only in my LIFTED classes, but in my main campus classes as well. I can't possibly know any more than a tiny fraction of what it took for my students to get to LIFTED, what it takes to get into this program, to earn your first 2 years of credits through the community colleges, to deal with the CDCR bureaucracy and the community college bureaucracy and the UCI bureaucracy. I can't know what it's like to have to read 200 pages of dense literary fiction every week while surrounded by noise, or to write essays when English isn't your first language, or you have learning differences, or you are dealing with trauma, and you're also taking 3 other courses at the same time. But what I can know is what I've seen in my LIFTED classrooms over the last 4 years, and what I've seen is nothing short of radically amazing. I've seen them become better readers, more patient, more open, more willing to suspend their disbelief or put up with density and opacity. I've seen them become more confident in their abilities as readers. I have seen them engage in complex, challenging, and often conflictual dialogue and debate, and to do so with rigor and seriousness and an immense amount of generosity. Put simply, my experience in LIFTED has made me believe deeply in prison education, but it's also helped renew and restore my sense of why college matters. My students in LIFTED are in college for a wide range of reasons. They are in college for their families, for their siblings and parents, for their kids and partners, for their nieces and nephews. They are in college to honor their ancestors, or they are there to break a family pattern. They are there for practical reasons as well as the love of learning. They are there to change their lives, whether that happens in front of the parole board or in the pages of a book. And they've changed my life too, helping me understand that when we are able to say something as simple as, "This thesis statement can be clearer," when we take patience to revise an essay or teach someone else how to do it, when we have the humility to say everything could always be better, clearer, stronger, we all receive something intangible but crucial in return. I'll end by reminding you that you too can be a part of LIFTED. If you're faculty at UCI, you can teach in the program, you can reach out to me for more info, or you can look for the campus-wide email we send out every fall recruiting faculty for the next year. You can also talk to your colleagues about the program and encourage them to learn more. And regardless of your position, you can give any amount, small or large, to help support the program by using the QR code on the screen. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Annie. We'll open it up to Q&A here in a second, and Judy and I will grab mics, and please wait till we get you a mic before you start talking. But I guess I wanted to start with just a very quick question. You started with this anecdote of being depressed in the pandemic, which resonated with me, and I'm sure with many of us. And I'm just curious, for those who don't find lifted, like what word would you have for them? You know, you talked about sort of finding something that you believe in. And I was just sort of curious to hear you sort of think about how and, you know, what that process looks like. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like part of what I realized in this experience, having this conversation with my friend, was that like you have these moments where you just feel overwhelmed by the vastness of the problems in the world and the vastness of the need, and the sort of impossibility of any individual meeting the needs of the world, particularly in the present moment. And I just sort of realized that like there was a way that was sort of, in my imagination, I was like, well, I have to go do something completely different. And I think that what I've learned is the importance of like doing work where you are, and finding the need in the spaces that you know the best and the institutions that you know the best, and sort of like cleaning up your own house in a way. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that talk. Really inspiring. You ended by saying that, you know, professors at UCI could join by teaching, but if I understood correctly, the subjects are sociology and English at the moment. So I had two questions. You know, I'm a physics professor. Is it possible in some way to join? And I'm also just curious how you chose, or maybe your heroine chose sociology to start with. Are there, you know, opportunities to expand ideas in that front?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So yes, there are opportunities to teach outside of humanities and social sciences. We offer a number of electives. So classes, any class that is doesn't have extensive prerequisites in a given major is a possibility. So and doesn't require like a elaborate lab. Though we have been able to figure out some like impressive workarounds with respect to classes that have a more hands-on component. So like students in an engineering class like built paper airplanes, for instance. So we don't have labs, but we try to do our best to integrate electives in the sciences as well. I believe that like part of the reason behind sociology was that it is a program that enables a lot of kind of like interdisciplinary collaboration. It also just fits well with the requirements that they had taken through the community college system. So it was partly practical and partly intellectual. It also provides them with a nice grounding in a field that for those of them who have the opportunity to be released in the future, it might help them towards professional development. And that was part of the aim with adding a humanities minor as well, was really working on teaching like writing and critical thinking skills that would be useful to them, whether they remain in the institution or end up being released later on. Yeah.
We have a question from chat, and then we'll go to Jeff. Sorry. The question from chat says, has your lifted experience made you more pessimistic or optimistic in general about the revolutionary possibilities of pedagogy?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I think I am a prison abolitionist, and I think it's important to acknowledge that teaching in a prison is not necessarily an abolitionist practice. You are collaborating with an institution that you may often find like morally and politically repugnant, which I do. But when is that not the case? We might feel that here at UCI occasionally as well. So I think it's important to be like sort of straightforward about like to what extent it is and is not like revolutionary. But it's definitely yeah, I think it's given me a really profound sense of the possibilities of like what pedagogy can do, and just like what the experience of like the simple experience of reading a book together and talking about it can do. I think it's easy to get a little jaded about that if you're sort of teaching the same classes year after year, and to sort of forget like why you got into the work in the first place. And I do think for me, at least, it's reminded me of like just the sort of amazing moments of like human connection and individual development that can happen through those conversations.
This was great. You caught my attention when you mentioned early on that one of the people you taught at San Quentin was Kafka.
Yeah.
I would love any anecdotes about teaching Kafka in a prison.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have a story about teaching Kafka in prison, which is that I had a student in the class who wrote his final paper on Kafka, and part of what he wrote his final paper about was the fact that he had been in a gang called the Aryan Brotherhood, which is an explicitly neo-Nazi organization. And when he first realized that he was going to have to write a paper about a Jewish writer, he didn't know what to do. I think it was like just sort of like he couldn't quite process what that meant. And he talked to a peer in the class, and he was like basically sort of like, will you write this paper for me? And the peer said, and he was going to like pay him he told me he was going to pay him in beef jerky. And the peer said, no, I'm not going to write the paper for you. Like, that's nonsense. Like, this program matters, and like we care about this program, and you're not taking it seriously if you do that. And so he was like, okay, I'm going to have to just like deal with my stuff around this. And he read the book and he loved it. He loved it. And it like, he described reading it as this like deep moment of like transformation where he had to like confront in himself his own prejudices, experience the narrative of this like Jewish writer a narrative that he deeply identified with, and like think about what it meant to identify with that story. And then write in this like incredibly, I mean, again, this is like the candor, right? In this incredibly honest way to me about his experience. And it was kind of like one of the most powerful like teaching moments that I've ever experienced. And I was like a, third year graduate student. I was just sort of like, I don't even know how I dealt with it, but it was a challenge for me too, right? Like, just to sort of reckon with the candor that was involved in telling me that.
Yeah, which was the novel?
Metamorphosis. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for educating us about this program. This is related to the first question. So are you restricted in any way or censored in any way in terms of like what content you can teach inside the prison?
Not one bit, no. It's really important to us that the same academic freedom and curricular flexibility that we have at UCI this is a UCI degree, and it has to extend to the institution as well. So I have lots of conversations with my students about, like I was actually teaching the night after the election last fall, and I knew that talking about the presidential election was going to be complicated because my lifted classes are actually like more politically diverse than my UCI main campus classes. And so I knew that some students would be reluctant to sort of like get into it about the presidential election, but we had like an incredibly open and honest and angry conversation about these two ballot initiatives, including those that expand the carceral institution, right? And a lot of our students do research on the sort of history and present and kind of like forms of social power and domination that exist in the carceral institution. So those conversations, as well as all kinds of complicated conversations about race and gender and sexuality, it's all fair game. So, yeah.
Hi, Annie. Thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. I'm just curious to know, are there teacher evaluations in this?
Yes.
And if so, what have you learned from that?
Oh.
Okay.
Yes, there are teacher evaluations, and they are also very, very candid. That's how I knew how much they hated reading Henry James. They were all like, we're really mad that we had to read this, but you have to make everybody else read this in the future because now it's like a rite of passage. So yeah, I mean I guess I learned the same things from the evals at Lifted that I learned on main campus, right? Like what works and what doesn't. I think it's interesting. Like one thing that I always notice both at San Quentin and at Donovan is that like students are really inclined they're very grateful for the fact that you're there. And I sometimes feel like in conversations with them, I have to sort of like push past that piece of the relationship so that we can get to something that's like, I'm not here, like I'm not like a services provider here to like give my time to you. Like we're actually engaged in the same intellectual process that is involved in my teaching on main campus. And so a lot of times in the evals, there's a lot of that sort of gratitude expressed, but there's also a lot of people that are like, I didn't like writing assignment number 2 or whatever. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your service. I was wondering if UCI Lifted is going to be offered in women's prisons, or is it currently only in men's facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So UCI Lifted is meant to be a pilot project, and the aim is to have programs like this at every UC, and we're part of the way there already with programs on 2 other UC campuses, one already in progress and the other in the works. And so we're working on engaging with prisons like across the state and producing these BA programs in all kinds of correctional facilities, including women's facilities.
Hi, Professor McClanahan. Good to see you again. You touched earlier on the propositions that would benefit the prisoners in these systems, and I'm curious as to how you deal with, their negative reactions on, Proposition 6 was voted against and it did not pass. Yeah. How do you deal with the prisoners' negative reactions to those kinds of things? Mm-hmm. They're treated as inhuman in prisons. Yeah. And I'm curious as to how you deal with that in your service to them.
Yeah, that's a great question. The conversation that we had about the indentured and the sort of forced labor proposition was like so powerful. It was particularly interesting because that quarter I was teaching the Kazuo Ishiguro novel Never Let Me Go, which if you've read it is also about forms of like dehumanization and the ways in which dehumanization is connected to the production of a group of people or a population as like a kind of social waste that can be like discarded. And we had like a really powerful conversation about how the proposition connected to the novel. And I feel like though a lot of it is just that like, I think that what they feel in their classes is that it's the opportunity for them to be treated and to imagine themselves as fully human. And that's like the thing that the humanities has always promised to do, and I think unfortunately doesn't always achieve. But I do feel like in these conversations, like there's a kind of recognition of a common humanity and a sense of engagement in a set of common problems that like is really powerful and really vital. And again, like sort of reminds me of like the power of what these dialogues around literature can do even outside of those environments.
I have a lifted adjacent question, which is, the people who are in your classes, they've done a BA. I mean, they've done the associates in order to get to your classes. Mm-hmm. But do you have a sense of like how many people who have associates at in the prison try to get into your program? Or I guess the other thing is how many, and again, not your expertise, but sort of what amount of people who are in the prisons have the chance to do the vocational training or the associates training? Yeah. Just, since you've shown how much it can help, like how many people are able to take advantage of any of those programs?
I mean, the work that the California community colleges have done in providing these associate's degree programs is like nothing short of awe-inspiring. It's really amazing. Like they were there first. Like as the minute that these laws started to change, they jumped in. And I think that's important because I suspect that when Trump changed these rules around federal Pell Grant eligibility, part of what he had in mind was getting for-profit institutions into prisons, because historically when public institutions fail to serve education needs in among incarcerated populations, the for-profit and the sort of correspondence school model like jumps in and does a lot of that in ways that are ultimately like not very good for the students. It's very exploitative often, and it's a lower quality product. And the community colleges jumped in, and they are now, again, they're graduating thousands of students every year with associate's degrees. And so I think part of the idea of expanding these programs, both expanding individual programs, so our program is thinking about expanding to a second yard at the same facility, but also expanding them in terms of other UCs being able to offer them. The need is absolutely there. It's just the infrastructure and the resources that we need.
Well, we are a little bit over time, but please join me once again in thanking Professor Annie McClanahan.